This podcast contains themes of misogyny, torture, and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Many of us grew up being afraid of the monsters under our beds, or the ones hiding in our closets. They often didn't take certain shapes in our minds, but led us to be afraid of every corner around us, and let our imaginations run wild. Maybe these monsters took the shapes of indistinguishable black masses, maybe the shape of large hairy beasts, or anything else otherworldly and in between. But what if I told you that hundreds of years ago, instead of being afraid of the things that go bump in the night, thousands of people were afraid of their very own neighbor? From the little girl that played outside on the lawn, to the old woman that routinely tended her garden. What if I told you that instead of fearing the unimaginable, their imaginations told them to fear the everyday person? And this wild imagination led to the death of countless innocent women. Welcome to Beyond the Folklore, a podcast project that centers around all things folklore and storytelling, with a special emphasis on women and why we tell these stories and the impact of them. I'm your host, Aubrey Blauvelt, and we'll be kicking off the first official episode of this podcast project with themes of the German witch trials and the historical context of that event. Witch hunts existed in Germany before the 15th century. However, it was between the 15th and 16th century when things really started to take a turn. Tensions rose, fear turned into terror, and then it was like a frenzy set in. Husbands accused wives, neighbors accused neighbors, fathers accused daughters, until it resulted in mass trials and, unfortunately, mass executions. When the 15th century hit, that's when things really took off. See, a prince bishop had ordered that it was law to hunt witches, meaning that the government had officially sanctioned for people to be tried and executed on suspicion of witchcraft. And that's when people were being accused left and right. But the thing is, the prince bishop who officially kicked off the mass hunt for the innocent had an agenda. Perhaps he wasn't afraid of the witch, but he knew how to play on others' fears and turn it into real terror. See, there was a rift in religious communities, and his goal was to solve that with a common enemy. He just so happened to also be able to use this new enemy as a way to get rid of anyone he wanted that didn't conform with his religion as well. Once the prince bishop had kicked off the witch trials, there became a problem. There were two types of people who began accusing others of being a witch. Those who also wanted to gain more from the situation, whether it be that they accused their neighbor because they had a personal grudge, or because they thought they could have more of an advantage and use their political agenda to accuse the innocent, or it was the everyday person whose fears and imagination were running wild because of all of these accusations, who saw these religious figures, these neighbors, these political figures being accused and then executed for being witches. And that to them said that their fears were real and the monster was real. And because of all of this, because of this event that started due to a prince bishop's religious and political agenda, the everyday person was now terrified of everyone around them. But unfortunately, that terror aimed more towards women. The imagination of everyone during that time was running wild. They were told that witches would take their babies, sacrifice them to demons the day they were born, that they were disguised as midwives, as elderly neighbors, as their own daughters. They were told that people were gathering to have orgies in the name of Satan, that they were having sexual relationships with demons in order to smite God, that they were holding these things called reverse Sabbaths to demonize everything else that the German community held as sacred. And that they were doing all of this while also harming their everyday neighbor, whether that be causing them to have illnesses, causing their cattle to die, their farm to not prosper. All of this was running wild in their imaginations. All of this, these people believed was happening in secret, and it was being done by their very own community. And then when this fear grew and grew and grew, that's when it turned into terror. And terror is usually what makes people act, until eventually it leads to real harm. And with the case of the German witch trials, thousands died, and the impact was global. Joining me today is a fellow graduate student from the University of Colorado Boulder. We'll be talking a little more in depth about why this happened, what happened when people were being tried as witches, and what the long-term repercussions were, as well as a few other questions that might show up. So joining me today is my friend Alex. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a third-year master's student at CU Boulder in their German department, and I study gender-inclusive language.
Oh, that's awesome.
Thanks.
So we're going to have some similar stuff going on with this discussion.
Neat.
But first, can you tell me what you know about the German witch trials?
I don't know too much. I know like what happened in Salem with those witch trials in America, and I was a TA for Scandinavian witchcraft, so we did talk about the prosecution and the influence of Christianity and pagan belief systems, and how that allowed women in particular to be scapegoated as witches.
So this talk might be kind of familiar to you, but hopefully there's some new stuff going on with what we're going to discuss today. The biggest thing that I heard was you saying how the witch trials that you and your class learned about when you were a TA were connected with the Salem witch trials. And I'm glad you brought that up because maybe you know this, but for the folks who might not, the German witch trials were really what kicked off everything. It's what started that global impact. Like the German witch trials were the reason we had the French witch trials, the English witch trials, and then later, of course, the Salem witch trials. And honestly, more in smaller areas all around both the Americas and Europe.
Neat. So, since we're talking kind of comparatively, what's the timeline of when these witch trials in either Germany or America, when did those kind of start, and what was like the kicking off point?
So the biggest thing about the witch trials is that they started in the late 15th century, but they were mostly going on specifically in Germany. In the early 16th century and 17th century is when they kind of bled into other places. But in 1571, that's when witch hunting became literally a law. A prince bishop put it into law that it was legal and even encouraged to hunt witches, and that's just when things kind of snowballed from there.
Was there any sort of bounty? Because, like, if this is a law, I'm thinking of, like, bounty hunters who prosecute people and kind of find them. Was that any sort of similar? Like, was there any rewards of, like, oh my gosh, you found a witch? Did that impact anybody's social status? Or is it just, like, we should get rid of them because they're a social nuisance?
Well, there wasn't necessarily a bounty, but when it started, people who were prosecuting these people who were being accused of witchcraft, people who were executing them, they were usually of higher social status, and then that also kind of skyrocketed their political gain. Or they were people who were doing it for another person who wanted more political gain, and then that put them in a really good position with the people who had more power for them. It didn't really give them money or a bounty, but when it started, it gave them more power socially, if that makes sense.
So if this is kind of interacting with the power balance, what kind of people were accused? I know traditionally when we think of witches, and because of that as a feminine term, we think of women, but what about like men and children? Or were they ever accused? What happened?
Well, everybody was accused. Like, it really, nobody was safe. It was predominantly women. Like, women had it the worst. In some cases, in two different villages, they were left with only one woman in those villages because women were targeted so badly. But when it first started, it wasn't necessarily women. It actually was people of power more, because this started, the law of witch hunting started because a prince bishop had really big political goals. He had his own agenda, so it targeted the elite first, right? Because he wanted to get people out of the way who didn't conform to his standards, who didn't conform to the norms. And then it bled down into the lower class, and then when lower classes got word that witches were being executed, that there was the existence of witches, and that the upper class people who were in charge, who were accusing these people, were saying that this thing is real, that people are in danger of it. That's just when people, their fears just took off, and then they started accusing everybody. But unfortunately, women were accused more because they would see a woman doing something just slightly out of the norm, and that was all it took. And then again, it wasn't just women. Like I said, it was also children. Like, at the youngest age of 3 would be getting accused and even executed for it. Nobody was safe.
Oh, I have two questions, but I want to start with so that's really interesting that it started in politics, because that's not, when we learn about the witch trial, we always think of, it's the women that are being scapegoated. Was there any difference between how they would treat um each accused, like women versus children versus men? Was there any sort of discrepancies in between those, of like, were they all given the same treatment because they were all considered witches and cohorts with the devil?
Honestly, they were all pretty much given the same treatment. They were all It was all executed the same way. Like, people were essentially tortured until they were like, okay, maybe I am a witch, because, no one ever lies, right? Um, but like the elite, in some cases, the elite got killed off more. Like, the people in higher positions in the government got killed off more frequently and faster, because they needed to do this like right away so they can get that political gain they wanted. And the people like in the lower classes, sometimes they were not found guilty. It didn't happen very often, but there's this woman who wasn't really of that much of a high social class. Her name was Apollonia Glader. She was tried as a witch. She was found not guilty, and she survived. So it was usually like lower middle class that could maybe get away with not being tried as a witch. But then again, very rare. Like I said, some villages left with only one woman in the village. And like the population impact was just insane.
Yeah. So we'll go back to my other question. What were like, so that you mentioned that if women or anybody was doing anything out of the ordinary, or they had like a lot of political power, they would get targeted. What about children? Children are usually seen as like innocent and uncorrupted, so how could they be roped into this?
Yeah, I mean, so for women, like I said, it's more of like they were breaking the norm, or like what society expected of them slightly. But children, it was a little bit easier for them to get accused, because a child would just be humming, and they would be like, oh, that child knows music? That child is singing to the devil. And like, for the most part, the children that were accused, however, they were either from lower class families or they were orphans. So part of it could be that people who were accusing these children were just looking for any excuse to get children that didn't really, they were outcasts of society, essentially, off the streets and like out of sight, out of mind. But unfortunately, their out of sight, out of mind was like, let's let's accuse these children of witchcraft and then execute them. But at the same time, again, like I said, all it took was a child either maybe being too loud, humming a song, or just being there at the wrong place at the wrong time. Then they would get accused and executed.
That's crazy. So you briefly mentioned that if anybody were to avoid and be lucky enough to get out of these witchcraft charges, would be like the middle, or you said lower middle class. What do you happen to know what their argument was, or what these kind of tests were to, like, how did these people get convicted as innocent rather than guilty?
It all boiled down to who was willing to testify for them. For the case of Apollonia Glader, it was her father who did. But for the most part, honestly, that's, again, a rare case because it would be fathers would testify against their own daughters. It just depended on who was pulling for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and even then, that didn't matter sometimes. For instance, when the Holy Roman Empire got word of how bad the German witch trials were going on, they had a person who was of a, pretty, high social standing. His wife was accused, Dorothea. She was accused of being a witch. He wrote to the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was like, "Don't kill this person. She is not a witch. We don't like what you're doing right now."
Mm-hmm.
And she was still executed.
Oh my gosh.
The Prince Bishop of Germany, who put all this into place, he ignored it. Even though he was doing these things in the name of the Catholic Church, he was just too far gone, and no amount of people pulling for her saying, "Oh no, she's not a witch," did it. She got executed.
Oh my goodness.
But for the people, again, who didn't, it really just depended on who was judging them and who was pulling for that person, saying, "Actually, this person's not a witch."
So how, was it always this kind of, I know you mentioned when it started, how long did this last, and was it the whole time so sensationalized? Oh my gosh, we have witches, let's find them and get rid of them. What was kind of the social interactions like during this time, and how did this impact, social goings?
See, it wasn't always this crazy. I mean, at the beginning, it really was just for political gain. The person who put this into, action, the person who made this law to hunt witches, was really just doing it because he had a goal of eradicating 3 groups of people:
Mhm.
the Jewish community, the Protestant community, and, anybody else he deemed outside of what he wanted his community to look like. So, it was very problematic, first of all. But he was mostly also just accusing other people of power so he could get more power.
Mm.
But then people started to kind of clue into what he was doing. So other people who wanted power started accusing
Mm.
other people
So
to get.
a snowball. They're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, this is a great way to get rid of my enemies.
Yeah,
I don't have to break a law and murder them. I can just have the government murder them."
exactly. But
Very
then,
timely.
v-
Very timely.
it was pretty strategic, if you ask me. I mean,
Huh.
in a very dark way. But then when these people were basically accusing other people of being witches just for their own political gain, just for their own agenda, other people outside of the government were basically seeing a solidification of their fears, right?
Mm.
They were saying, "Oh, the government would never lie to me. So if the government is saying that my neighbors could be witches,
Mhm.
could be these things that are apparently dangerous, could be monsters to me, then that means it's true because I'm watching the government
Mhm.
execute all these people, and they would never execute innocent people at all, ever." And that's why, things just snowballed for, a good moment, at least 50 years, until people became a little bit more vocal that this
Mhm.
was, a ridiculous thing to do, and also until the population was, severely impacted.
That's so interesting that you say that, oh, the government wouldn't do this, and that kind of became such an easy way to be like, oh, well, if the government's doing it, it can't be wrong. Kind of on that, was the church super involved in this as well? Because I know with what, I did with the Scandinavia stuff, if you were not Christian or whatever the main religion was, they considered you a heretic. And that is a very easy way to, oh, you're a heretic, you consort with the devil, oh, you must be a witch. Is that also seen, or do you believe that there's more of a political influence rather than religious?
I definitely think that it was more political than religious. And speaking of the church, people in the church weren't even safe. There was at least 19 priests who were found guilty and then executed as well. It was essentially for political gain. And I believe these priests were priests that were questioning the methods, because the person who started all this, the prince bishop who put this into law, he was saying he was doing it in the name of the Catholic Church, because the predominant religion was Catholicism, right?
Mhm.
And then anybody else who was in that church who was like, maybe we shouldn't torture people,
Yeah.
were then thought to be witches, because why would a witch want to get tortured, right? So that In terms of the people who were doing the accusing who had more social standing, it was definitely more political. In terms of the people who had a lower social standing,
Mhm.
I would say that was more religious because of all of the rumors that were going around, the stories that were being told, and there were some wild stories that was really playing on their religious fear. And then that fear really turned into terror that all of their beliefs were becoming true and
Mm.
it was happening with their neighbors, with their kids, with their daughters, with their wives.
Oh, yeah, so that's crazy. Yeah, even if you spoke up, you're considered one of them, so that's but so you kind of mentioned so they in addition to executing once they found guilty, and I remember from the Salem and witch trials and from the Scandinavian ones, these tests were absolutely insane. Like if your body, what was it? If you they would tie rocks to you, and if your body did not float, because why would it float? It has rocks tied to it. You're clearly a witch. So in addition to executing these people, did they like torture them as well? And why would they? Why was that considered beneficial? Did it have any gain, or is it just like, oh, we're torturing the devil?
I mean, I think the case is once people were accused of witchcraft, they already believed it.
Mm.
So they just needed to torture these people into saying what they wanted to hear,
Ah, yeah, so like what's the word?
coercing.
Coercing. Yeah. Okay, that's yeah.
Yeah, people were coerced into saying, "Yes, I'm a witch." I mean, they were tortured to the point of breaking,
Mhm.
to the point of lying and giving themselves a sentence that led to death,
Mhm.
because death would have been a mercy for them at that point because of how badly they were tortured.
Oh my gosh. I kind of have another question. So, I know that you and I have talked about the act of performance. Um, and that was a big thing that we touched on in my Scandinavian class that, to perform witchcraft, you have to perform. You have to stand up and, physically, you have to make this whole grand thing. You have to say it in front of a whole bunch of people, and a lot of people have to witness this. Did that? I'm guessing from what you said that that was also not an aspect of perhaps witchcraft ideology of having a performance of doing it. It's just humming and just small acts, or was that also were there seen big, large performances or acts of witchcraft as well? And would that differ how they treated them?
I mean, it depended. For the most part, it was word of mouth kind of things, right? Like somebody said, "Oh, well, I saw this person doing something really weird in the corner," and then that whisper just was a chain reaction. But there are like cases where somebody maybe performed something
Mhm.
that would have been considered performing witchcraft, right? The biggest example of this actually started before the witch trials really took off. So in 1512, there was this historical event that also has, like, a lot of folklore and a lot of, like, exaggerated narrative, to it. It's called the Dancing Plague. Do you
Mhm.
know anything about that?
Um, I can only think of like the Pied Piper, but I don't really know super much about the Dancing Plague. But wait, you're telling me that like the fear of witches was around before the witch trials? Like what was do you know like the moment where he was like, "Okay, yes, now we must start killing the witches."
The fear of the witch was definitely around before the witch hunting became law. It was just that when the Prince Bishop was making this law and wanting to gain more political power and wanting to make a community to look the way he specifically wanted it to look, he played on a fear that was already in existence.
Mm.
But in 1512, with the dancing plague, people blamed it on a woman and said that she was a witch. And back to your like question of performance, it was because she was singing to herself and dancing a little bit. She was performing in a way that was outside of the norm for a woman to do. And on top of that, she was like an older woman without a husband, so that also kind of damned her a little bit. And then people started performing it as well until it was a chain reaction, until
Mhm.
there was mass hysteria going on. And
They're performing the dancing or
yeah,
okay, yeah.
they were dancing, like essentially people were dancing themselves to death. And the theory is that potentially all of these people were on drugs and those drugs were tainted and then they
Mhm.
poisoned themselves. But, when things are going on, we don't really have a lot of scientific evidence to like
Mhm.
back it up. We're going to blame the thing that we want to blame.
Yeah.
And one singular woman was blamed of being a witch and causing people to dance themselves to death.
That's crazy. So I know that I mentioned that it kind of sparks memories of the Pied Piper. Do you know how those two kind of interact with each other, or if they have like an actual link, like what that progression looks like from this woman singing and dancing, having a good old time by herself to be accused to a witch, and then this folk tale that I grew up with that as a child.
Well, I mean, a lot of folk tales came out of this historical event, right? A lot of folk tales came out of the witch trials, but the folk tales also came from the dancing plague. The dancing plague sparked its own type of folklore. The Pied Piper being one of this, right? Because the story of the Pied Piper is a person comes into town, a person that they're not sure of, gets rid of the rats. The town does not pay him for that. So then the Pied Piper makes all the children dance themselves out of the town, and usually the story goes that they're all danced off a cliff.
And don't forget the music. I think he had a flute. And clearly, if singing to yourself and a 3-year-old knowing music is insane, if somebody has the capability to play a musical instrument, absolutely see how they could get accused so easily.
Yeah, the music is kind of a common thread because it's, again, outside of the norm. If the Catholic Church isn't controlling it, then you're going to be accused of being a witch or consorting with a devil in some sort of way, right? But also, you can take on this, like, person comes in who breaks the norm, right? The woman in the dancing plague, the woman who they're blaming this thing on, was dancing alone to herself. She was breaking a norm. She wasn't acting how...
Hanging out.
Yeah, she was...
I did it at a time. Am I a witch? Aubrey.
See, she was doing something that was against what society wanted her to do. This person comes in. He is not from the village. He is essentially an outsider, just like all of the other women that they are accusing of being witches. So you have that sense of, like, outsiders coming in being dangerous. That is also what came from this fear of the witch. What came from this historical event was that people were worried about what they didn't know, about anybody who didn't fit this Catholic Church-going type of person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely, we can see from history just finding the scapegoats. In my experience, I've noticed it's usually religiously based, and you mentioned like the lower class people had that. So yeah, that definitely makes sense. So clearly we're not still like hunting witches. What kind of finally caused this to die down? I know that you said, oh, I can't remember what country it was, but the other country was like, or the Holy Roman Empire was like, don't kill this woman. So clearly there were people who opposed this, but what made it, this is not law. Germans aren't still killing not witches. So
Honestly, it was outside sources that kind of made it die down, right? Because inside, people were also criticizing within the German community, right? There was a man who...
they were just witches too, clearly.
Yeah, there was a man who literally, he was like, maybe we shouldn't torture them. He wasn't even against the witch trials.
We can just kill him real quick. We don't have to torture him. Well, I mean,
yeah, exactly. He wasn't even against the witch trials. He was just like, maybe we'll get, like, better results if we don't, like, force them to do it, right? He was against torture specifically. He worked for a university. He was of high standing. But as soon as he said that, as soon as he was like, maybe no more torture, they were like, witch.
no, you don't want your fellow people to be tortured? You have to be a witch.
And then they tortured him
Love it.
until he was forced to confess that he was a witch, and then he was executed.
Goodness.
But
there's a lot of gaslighting in this period.
yeah, this is
The
like
girl
gaslighting
kept and gaslit the hell out of these people.
for real. But it was the people outside of it. Like I said, the Holy Roman Empire, like, the turning point really was when the Holy Roman Empire was like, do not kill this person. And Germany was like, well, too late. I did.
Oops.
And then they continued to criticize the German witch trials until it died down. But like, with that though, the impact was already, like, it was moved on.
Yeah.
The French were doing it, the English, and then America was doing it. It was already, like, happening. And even then, like, witch trials still happened here and there a little bit once it had died down. It just wasn't as bad. But again, remember, this started out with, like, thousands of people dying, and their population was impacted. So they also needed to be like, let's stop.
We need people. We're gonna start a world war in a couple years.
They realized that, like, with all of these, like, thousands of people being dead, that wasn't stopping, like, diseases from running through communities. It wasn't stopping people from starving and famine from happening. And on top of that, the lower class were getting so angry from being accused that they stopped supplying the witch executions with wood.
Oh, wow.
They were like, no, we're not.
We own wood, rich people.
Literally, they were like, we're not going to burn another one of us because we've already burned so many. There's one lady in this village left. How are we going to procreate? We're screwed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I would ask, if the fear of the witch ever went away, but I kind of know that, in the 70s in America, we had the whole, satanic craze, and people were like, witches and Satan get kind of together. But no, I think this is really interesting because what I learned in that class that I was in, how much witchcraft and the idea of witchcraft is rooted in Nazism. Like, I cannot remember the name of the houses, like the old farmhouses. They even have runes in their like scaffolding on the walls because they were protected. So clearly, even though witchcraft was so highly critiqued for so many years, do you happen to know like how it ever became a shift? I kind of do. What do you think?
So I don't know actually too much about this. Give me more. I only know a little bit about Nordic like witchcraft, but that's like the stuff from back when like people were practicing like Norse mythology and stuff and like satyr magic of Odin. I don't know like more modern.
Yeah, what we kind of discussed, and I'm really bad at dates, so I'm not going to give you any. Um, but essentially, like those old German houses, the ones that have those big beams, those would have like runes in them to protect the house, and that witchcraft became really, really closely tied to Nazism because it was one of the ways that they were able to, oh, we're white, that's better, and then oh look, they took those ideas from pagan beliefs, and at first they were like, oh, these are terrible, terrible, and then they were like, oh, well, maybe we could just appropriate that. And yeah, it became one of the ways that, they would even do rune yoga where like my professor had mentioned that, they would stand in like the letter F and go F because they were doing so clearly I'm curious, and you might not have the answer of how this idea shifted so much because clearly for many years from like 1512 to so much later, witches were hunted and, seen, but then the Germans, specifically the Nazis, were like, "Oh, that's cool. We could use this." I'm curious what switched that shift.
Oh, so it's almost like an inverse of like the witch trials. Like anybody who's seeing like connecting with any kind of witchcraft was bad, but for the Nazis it was like, oh, they're more
It
powerful.
was another way to say this is why we're better than you.
I almost wonder, I think my answer, knowing everything that I know about the witch trials, is that and correct me if I'm wrong, but were the Nazis who were practicing it, they were probably men, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we spoke specifically about gender roles, but yeah, usually, just like you mentioned, it was probably for political gain as well. So, they're taking these startings of, witchcraft in general and they're using it for political power. And historically speaking, that is men, white men, especially Germany, it's white men.
Yeah. So if I were going to give any kind of answer, and again, this is probably just me theorizing, I would say that the reason it was acceptable well, first of all, Nazis gross. But like the reason why there was this shift probably because of who was seen practicing it. In the witch trials, when all of these women were being accused, they were being accused because they were breaking norms, because they were slightly too aggressive, they were slightly more outspoken, they had some sort of independence outside of having a husband or independent wealth, and they were needing to be controlled. So what the people were doing was controlling them by accusing them of being witches. So not only were they getting rid of the people they couldn't control, but for any other woman watching, they were trying to scare them into control. Whereas this shift with like the Nazi party, like you're saying, they didn't need to control anybody with this. They wanted to gain control. So if the person that they are putting at like the highest social standing is doing it, then that's why it's acceptable.
Yeah.
It's not fair.
No.
And Nazis gross.
Nazis gross.
But that would be my theory for why there was a shift, because it was dependent on the person doing it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's super interesting. And I've noticed when I was in Germany last year, and it seemed to be localized, there was still a prominence of witchcraft and depictions of witches. I noticed more personally in southern Germany, but it's really interesting. So that this kind of had, it might have been in the 1500s, but clearly if it's influencing the Nazi party and there are still a bunch of artwork, it's interesting to see how long lasting this phenomena was.
Well, I think there's also kind of like a shift in a reclamation of witchcraft, because the witchcraft that people during the witch trials thought people were doing was very, very different, and also still rooted in these Christian ideas of of what witchcraft can be, whereas like today, witchcraft is not like it's not about Christian tradition. Back then, there was a very much like if you are not Catholic, you are worshiping the devil, and that is not at all what witchcraft is now.
Yeah.
At all. There's no devil involved, really. That's not what paganism is. That's just how the people in the 1500s and 1600s, when they were doing these trials, thought, because they really just had a Christianized view of anybody who was outside of the norm and what was going on with that.
This is something I forgot to ask earlier. So I know that we mentioned the types of things that people would construe as witchcraft, but and once again from my class, like we talked about the different types, like love spells or destruction, or for farming. What kind of magic do you think humming, or what do you think that these people were like? What type of magic were they getting accused of?
Oh gosh, it was so different. For the German witch trials, it was way different than like any of the witchcraft for like Nordic settings or for like today. People, like I said, they would be accused just for humming. Why was humming so bad? Humming was so bad because they thought that they were singing to the devil. It was everything having to do with the devil, right? People who were being accused because people were like, oh, that person is having a physical relationship with the devil.
Oh my gosh.
Like even children, like I said earlier on, children of the age of 3 were being accused. And that was because they thought that these children were having physical relationships with demons and the devil. Yeah, even the prince bishop who enacted all of this, he thought his nephew was having sex with a demon.
I think the bishop might have been having sex with people. Honestly, I mean, he doesn't sound like a great guy. I think maybe we should have accused him.
I mean, honestly, this is definitely not God's work because it is murder, but they weren't seeing it as murder, right? Because like to accuse a witch, you were putting down like the devil's advocate, literally. So that's how they got around murdering hundreds and hundreds of people. But they also like they were so convinced that all of these women were getting together at the middle of the night to have like reverse Sabbaths and have orgies with demons.
Dancing in the forest.
Yeah. Sacrificing babies. There was like a big time frame where these people were afraid of their own midwives because they thought that these midwives would take these freshly born babies and then kill them in the name of Satan.
Was there actually any proof ever of like anybody doing any like, so I know that rumors can spread and start places, but were any of these ever rooted in like, did maybe one person go insane and kill a baby, or is this just absolutely rooted in nonsense? Like, were there any cases of ever of like, you know, maybe there was one dude in the forest worshiping Satan dance around in a circle? Was that
No,
no?
not really. I mean, the thing is that people unfortunately tend to murder people, right? And they thought like murder was the reason for witchcraft and stuff like that. But the thing is that these people who murdered other people were usually men. So for women, again, it was just that these women were breaking very small social norms that would be normal for us today.
Absolutely.
And it scared people. On top of that, surrounding them was, again, a lot of disease. A lot of disease.
And they know it so probably. They're like, oh, I have a cold. Must be the devil. Must be my next door neighbor.
Yeah, they didn't know. They didn't have science. On top of that, people were starving. Anytime there was bad crops, anything like that was going to be... They didn't understand. We didn't have the science we had now. And they already had rumors from the church that witches existed. So they needed a monster. They needed a reason to blame what they couldn't explain. And that's what really caused it.
I think this is a good question, and I probably should have asked this earlier, where the idea of witchcraft came from. Like, I know from like the Nordic side, Christians were like, oh, pagans, because they like do earth stuff. That's definitely witchcraft. But do you know kind of how this phenomenon even started? I know that's a really big question because clearly it was present in Germany, in France, and all of Europe. And I think every country probably has some sort of folklore or story involving witchcraft and a negative depiction. I'm just curious if you happen to know that.
Honestly, just like any traditional narrative, it's really hard to track the origins because things come... One story could have 5,000 different bits of origins for why it's told and why it's changed over time. So I don't have an exact answer for you. I think for the most part, the witch of the witch trials came about just because of political gain. Like I said, it's just because they needed a monster to fear, and people in power needed a reason to gain more power. So when people have fear, and when they are feeling that fear turns into terror, they're acting. Their monsters are being solidified. Their worst nightmares are coming true. And that's just how it started.
Wow, well, that's crazy. That's
Kind of bleak.
very bleak. Hopefully that doesn't start happening again. But yeah, no, this is super, super interesting. So one of the last questions that I have, because we talked about the lasting effects, and since I know you know folklore, were there any other like folk stories that came out of witches? Like, I know we talk about warlocks and things, dragons. Was there any sort of other folklore that came out of this period?
Well, I mean, again, we talked about the dancing plague, which it did happen before witch hunting became law, but the folklorization of that historical event itself is just one really strong example because, again, we have this instance of mass hysteria and people are blaming it on witchcraft, right? Even though there are other theories, the big thing, and when we tell this today, still, we're saying, oh, it's a mystery, like this is otherworldly that this is happening. From that bit of like historical / folklore item, we also have the Pied Piper, but then we also have like so many different stories afterwards as well, right? We have and during, because people would also experience sleep paralysis and they'd be like, that's blamed on a witch, but that's something that I will discuss later on in another episode.
Oh, I'm excited to listen for it.
Yeah, but then also when the witch trials died down, people were still having these like fears, they still had these stories, and it almost became like mini witch trials, but more so like individualized and in your own home. Because what took the place of it was this not fear of the witch, but fear of demonic possession.
Oh,
And
yeah.
all of the narratives we have on that, like all of those fears kind of come from the witch trials.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about that.
That is for another episode as well.
Really? Okay, this sounds like a good podcast then.
So before we wrap up, are there any lingering questions, anything else that you can think of?
No, I think you gave a really good summary and you went in depth. I'm terrible at dates, but yeah, I think you answered everything I could ever want to know about this.
Yeah, and I mean, dates are kind of hard because, like I said,
Numbers?
well, numbers, but in general, dating the German witch trials, we have like when the law went into place, but we know that witch hunts were happening before then and even after things died down. And again, like I said, the impact was global.
Yeah, and with folklore, a lot of these things are orally transmitted. So, we've probably all played the telephone game where I can tell you one thing and by the time you get to the end of that story. So I wish, long story short, I wish we had a time machine because that'd be so interesting to see. I would probably be accused, definitely.
Yeah, I don't think we would make it very far.
But, if we could just hide in the forest.
I think that makes us look even more suspicious.
Well, I'm glad I don't live in 1512, so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Me too. Well, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Real quick, is there anything you want to plug? Anything for our listeners to read or to look at with your research?
I mean, if you're interested in gender-inclusive language in German, my thesis that I'll publish for my master's, that's with Becoming Charlie. It's the first genderqueer representation in German media by a German broadcasting company. So if you're interested in that, you can find me on the CU Boulder website. And in the fall, you can see me at Penn State University's Applied Linguistics program in case you're ever curious. But I'm curious to see what you do next, Aubrey.
That is a big question, but I will let you and all my listeners know as soon as I know.
On the next episode.
On the next episode, maybe. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Beyond the Folklore. Today we talked about the German witch trials and its global impact. Now, I want to leave you all with one lingering question. There's this concept that the scary stories we tell come from fear, and that fear causes us to talk, to start rumors. But when fear develops into terror, that's when it causes us to act. We saw the fear of the witch grow into terror, and that terror caused thousands to die. Today, can you tell when fear turns into terror? Are there other events in history that you can think of where terror has caused people to act, whether that terror is misguided or not? What is the impact of our actions when we let terror control what we do, what we think, what we say, and even the laws we put in place? Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for future episodes.